God calls to Abraham to get him to leave his father's tent. He's there like till he's 80, lagging around, lolling around, being useless.
Welcome back to another episode of Adam's Fall. Was Joseph Smith a villain, a scoundrel, a sex addict, or a hero? In case you don't know much about Joseph Smith, he was born in 1805 and died in 1844 and founded the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as the Mormons. And he claimed divine revelations that led to the restoration of what he believed was Christ's true church. Throughout his life, Joseph Smith suffered greatly because of his claims. He was tarred and feathered, imprisoned, actually on multiple occasions, and eventually was murdered by a mob at the young age of 38 while he was imprisoned. He sealed his testimony with his blood. You could say that's a very heroic act. On his way to being imprisoned before he was martyred, he reportedly described his feelings as such: "I am going like a lamb to the slaughter, but I am calm as a summer's morning. I have conscience, void of offense toward God and towards all men. If they take my life, I shall die an innocent man, and my blood shall cry from the ground for vengeance. And it shall be said of me, he was murdered in cold blood." It is with this background that I always wanted to explore the heroic arc of Joseph Smith. In my opinion, his arc and revelations demonstrate many archetypal patterns that would converge with the Jordan Peterson, Carl Jung, and Joseph Campbell framework. And one of these archetypes is, quote, the hero's journey. Now, as background, there are many heroes' journeys in the scriptures, and Jordan Peterson frequently talks about these examples. A couple notable ones would be Abraham and Moses, of course, Jesus in the New Testament, but I think Joseph Smith's story falls right along with some of these notable examples. So I want to review a video about Jordan Peterson talking about God calling prophets and how they embark on the hero's journey. And then I'll come back to Joseph Smith about how he also follows that same archetype. So let's take a look at a clip from Jordan Peterson about God as the call to adventure.
Another way of thinking about this too, in the Abrahamic stories, God calls to Abraham to get him to leave his father's tent. He's there like till he's 80, lagging around, lolling around, being useless. And the call to adventure arises, and it's attributed to the voice of God. And Abraham goes out in the world, and he has a hell of a terrible time of it. He encounters famine and tyranny and conspiracy to steal his wife. And it's really quite dreadful, to the point where you might think that Abraham was a lot better off just being in his tent.
So this is very interesting. God calls, for example, Abraham out of the comfort of his own home. This is very similar to Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith was a young teenager when he received the call, the first vision, he reports. Did his life get better eventually because he heeded this call? No, his life got more difficult. It would have almost been better if he had just been a simple farmer like his father before him and avoided the call. But the call to adventure from God is not a call that leads to pleasure. If anything, we know from Jesus as the ultimate archetype of the hero's journey, you descend into hell. Jesus defeated sin and death, which was the ultimate condescension. So when God gives us a call, it does not mean that our life will be easy. If anything, it's going to get more difficult.
But the story insists that Abraham's adventure is not only necessary, but a precondition for, well, for the entirety of Western civilization that follows in his stead, essentially. And so it's difficult, but necessary.
And Joseph Smith's call, also like Abraham, would bless future generations. Joseph, according to his revelations, was called to restore the gospel of Jesus Christ, which would spread throughout the world and bless all nations. So this call was about more than Joseph Smith. It was about the fruits that would come generation after generation.
And I think there's an analogy between the voice that calls Abraham as an individual away from his father's tent, the safe confines of his father's tent, and the political voice that calls Moses to pull his entire people out of the tyranny in Egypt. I don't think that's an unreasonable parallelism. And so God in that situation is the voice of adventure and the voice of freedom. Okay, now, Moses heeds this call and convinces the Pharaoh, eventually, to let the Israelites go. And so they leave tyranny. And the story is very interesting to me because it's so sophisticated in structure, because you might think once you get out of the tyranny, problem solved, right? And you could even think about this in terms of the tyranny of your own preconceptions. You drop the constraints you've laid upon yourself, the arbitrary constraints you've laid upon yourself, or you stop imposing your will on other people, or you escape from political or social tyranny, and everything's immediately better. And that's not what happens in the story at all. What happens is that the Israelites go from the tyranny into the desert. And it's not obvious at all that the desert is an improvement over the tyranny. And it's also a very strange story, because if you think about the story geographically, the desert that the Israelites were hypothetically wandering through isn't that big. And they're there for like 45 years, and you think, well, that's kind of a failure of leadership. It'd take like 2 weeks to walk across the desert, yet they're out there for 45 years or 40 years. What can that possibly mean? And what it means, I think, it means a variety of things, but apart from the fact that it's out of the tyranny into the desert, which is really something to think about. Like, why won't you drop your stubborn preconceptions if they're just constraining you, Or why would people subject themselves to totalitarian oppression if they could just let it go and then everything would be all right? And the answer is, everything wouldn't be all right. It might get worse initially. And that's sort of what seems to happen in the Exodus story. It's like in the desert. And how long? 40 years, 3 generations.
Yeah, when you make a major change in your life, you try to lose weight, you try to stop an addiction, does it get easier? No, it gets harder. You have the withdrawals, you have the temptations, you enter the spiritual desert. It gets better eventually, but there is a trial period, there's the desert. One of the most interesting parts about Lehi's vision is at the start of the vision, when he meets a messenger, and the messenger doesn't take him straight to the tree of life. In fact, the messenger guides him and he enters a waste. And then out of desperation, he prays, and it's through the tender mercies that he has a vision of the tree of life, or the love of God. So when we are called by God, we are not directly led to the promised land. We are first led to difficult pastures. And this is part of the hero's journey. Joseph Smith heeded the call of the first vision and of the angel Moroni. He brought forth the Book of Mormon and other revelations, but this led to many trials and persecutions of his family and himself and of the Latter-day Saints, which eventually led them to escape to Utah. But what are the fruits of this now? The fruits of their trials have brought forth much joy to millions of people. Now, with all this said, I want to actually look more closely at the archetype of the hero's journey. Joseph Smith's life story can be interpreted through the lens of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. He's best known for his 1949 book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which introduced the, quote, monomyth theory, suggesting that myths from different cultures share a fundamental structure, often reflecting a hero's journey. Campbell's work was influenced by Jungian psychology, literary theory, and mythic scholarship. So we'll take a look at some of the stages. There are traditional 12 stages of the hero's journey. So the first stage is the ordinary world. And so this is where the hero has a, quote, normal life before the adventure begins. And we see from Moses or Abraham, they seem to be living their normal lives. And this was the same with Joseph Smith, who was not born into a privileged world, but into a poor farming family in early 19th century America. His life was ordinary and marked by hardship, illness, and limited formal education. But the story of Joseph Smith, as it pertains to us, really starts with his call to adventure. Much like Moses and Abraham were called by God, the hero is faced with an event or discovery that beckons them to begin a journey. At age 14, during the religious revival known as the, quote, burned over district movement, Joseph was confused by competing religious claims. He read James 1:5, which led him to pray for guidance. In response, he experienced the first vision, a theophany in which God the Father and Jesus Christ appeared to him, calling him to restore the true church. Then there is stage 3, which often is the refusal of the call, or being slow to heed the call. And this is where the hero hesitates or feels unworthy of the journey. Now, Joseph was only 14 when he reportedly had this vision. I can understand him being reluctant to share his vision. And when he did, he often experienced ridicule, rejection, and persecution from clergy and townspeople. His account mentions fear and self-doubt and his reluctance to share details widely. But there's often, and you see this in the Lord of the Rings movies, that there is a mentor. There is the wizard that comes and guides the ordinary person on their journey. The hero gains help or insight from a guide. And this was very interesting to me when I studied the hero's archetype, and that is because Joseph was visited by an angel named Moroni, who taught him about the ancient record, the Book of Mormon, and prepared him over 4 years to receive the golden plates. These repeated visitations were instructional and formative. So Joseph Smith also had a mentor, and you see this so often in the movies. Luke Skywalker met Obi-Wan Kenobi, who became his mentor and helped him on his journey. Now there's a point where the hero leaves the ordinary world and begins the adventure. And Joseph Smith, after tutoring from the angel Moroni, in 1827 obtained the gold plates, translating them with divine aid, and this marked his departure from his previous life into a prophetic mission. He published the Book of Mormon in 1830 and officially organized the church in that same year. And it was at this point where he crossed the threshold. This was the point of no return. Now, like Moses and the Israelites or Abraham, did this lead to good things? Yes, in some ways it did, but of course that meant a lot of trials. So the hero faces trials, does make allies, and confronts enemies. So, for example, he had translation challenges, financial hardships. There was a lot of skepticism and persecution. He did, though, meet some additional supports, like Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, his wife Emma Smith, and some of the early saints. But he had a lot of enemies, hostile neighbors, mobs, critics, and later even governmental opposition. And then, which is so common in these stories, there was betrayal. People that were once loyal later left and betrayed him. And of course, he faced a lot of direct persecution and physical harm, like being tarred and feathered in 1832. And so at some point, Joseph Smith, or the hero, has to get deeper wisdom, like Luke Skywalker meeting Yoda and getting Jedi training. And Joseph Smith had revelations that pushed him deeper in about building temples, about establishing Zion, about obtaining priesthood authority and celestial doctrines. But eventually, during the period when the saints moved to Nauvoo, tensions escalated. Now there are ordeals that the hero must face, and Joseph Smith faced a major crisis or challenge that represents a life or death situation. And the ultimate ordeal was Joseph Smith's arrest, imprisonment, and martyrdom. In Carthage jail, he and his brother Hiram were killed by a mob in 1844. This was the climactic life or death confrontation. And often in the typical hero's journey, the hero survives. But in this case, Joseph Smith was killed. There is often a reward of wisdom or insight that is gained from death. Now, the reward in this case was that Joseph sealed his testimony with his blood. And it was this that helped propel the saints to move forward and expound upon what Joseph had taught and turn the Church of Jesus Christ into a global organization. Now, I want to conclude by talking more about Joseph Smith. Was he a villain? Was he a scoundrel? Or was he a hero? People have argued all different points of view, but I don't think there's any doubt that Joseph Smith did follow the heroic archetype in so many ways. And the legacy of Joseph Smith for millions of people has been great. The fruits of Mormonism has brought much joy to my ancestors and many others. So in my view, he was definitely a hero. I look forward to your comments and suggestions. Until the next video.